All right, everyone. Looks like some people are still filtering in. Thought I would go ahead and get started. So my name is Michael Shults, and I teach saxophone at the University of Memphis, Rudy Scheidt School of Music, and I teach both the classical saxophone studio and the jazz saxophone majors, and also saxophone quartets and jazz improvisation and jazz combos. And I wanted to talk a little bit today about kind of this whole concept of trying to play jazz saxophone and classical saxophone, and trying to do it in a way that's equally fluent in both styles. And I'll talk a little bit about pedagogy maybe at the end if we have time. But mostly I really want to talk about more philosophical things, and also this idea of what are some checkpoints if we're trying to develop our skills equally in both strains. What are some things we can check off the list that says, okay, I'm really authentic. And some of that's subjective and some of it's objective, I think. And really, I just kind of want to get a conversation started. I don't have all the answers yet, and I certainly don't mean to position myself as the ultimate authority on this subject. But it's something it's been on my mind a lot, over the past few years, and I wanted to kind of share some of the things I'm talking about. So, the first thing that might be valuable, I guess, is to maybe talk a little bit about my background. I mean, I don't want this to be overly biographical, and probably people don't care that much, but it might kind of lend some clarity to the stuff I talk about later. So I grew up in a small town in Northeast Missouri called Hannibal, Missouri. About 17,000 people there. So not really a place where I had a lot of great instruction to private teachers in either jazz or classical. I did take a couple of lessons in Hannibal from a former band director named Patrick Harrison, who was a really good saxophone player, but they were kind of ad hoc every once in a while. And drove up to Kirksville, Missouri, which was about 2.5 hours away, to take some lessons with Randy Smith, who was at Truman State for a long time. But this is all to say that it was easier for me at that time because I had easier access to recordings and to like jazz radio and summer jazz camps. I just had jazz saxophone modeled to me a little bit more, and I had a more natural bent towards that particular strain at that time. And so I didn't really do I maybe did solo and ensemble a couple times. I might have auditioned for district band, but it just wasn't really on my radar. And then fast forward a few years later, and I had was looking at colleges and really wanted to study with Bobby Watson, who was one of my heroes at the time, still is one of my heroes, who was teaching at UMKC. And so I had made All-State in the jazz band and was a little, confident, bordering on cocky at that point in terms of my jazz playing. And I went there to audition for the conservatory, and that was kind of my dream, was just to study with Bobby. In fact, I didn't audition anywhere else. And so I played, and everything went well, and they offered me acceptance and a scholarship. And then I went to audition. I hadn't looked into the degree program at that point, but I just knew that I had to do an audition with the classical saxophone professor, who at that time was Tim Timmons. He was a student of Fred Hemke's and taught at UMKC for, 30, 35 years or so. So I strode in there with the kind of, confidence bordering on ignorance that only an 18-year-old from Hannibal, Missouri can have. And I played, I think I played the Bach BWV 1035 transcription on a Meyer 6 with a large chamber, subtoning the low notes, totally ridiculous, interpretation of this music. And I got done playing, and Tim was trying to be complimentary as best as he could. And he said, a couple of things like, well, you sound good, but it sounds like you've mostly studied jazz and you could, stand to get some classical training. And I kind of looked him dead in the eye and said like, well, I think classical saxophone, I just don't really get it. It's not really something I'm interested in. So, just so you know, I'm not going to study classical where I'm here at the conservatory. And he kind of paused and looked at me and said, well, you have to, it's part of the degree. You have to take 4 semesters of classical saxophone with me, and you'll have to play in the wind ensemble. So it doesn't really matter whether you care about it or not. And so that was very sobering. And then I got a letter from the conservatory that said that I had been accepted and, had gotten this big scholarship from the jazz department, but I was actually only accepted at the 100A level, which basically means I was probationary. So I had a semester to sort of prove myself, so to speak, or it was flunk out and go back to Hannibal. And that was a sort of serendipitous, I think, because that first semester I took those classical lessons. Basically what it was is that Tim Timmons had kind of said like, yeah, this kid seems like he's got an attitude and his classical playing is terrible. So, let's accept him because he has some potential, but he needs to prove himself. And so I found myself, out of fear practicing classical as much as I was practicing jazz at that time. And I ended up really liking, almost immediately, I liked Tim's teaching. It felt more concrete, sequential to me, that I sort of had these concrete, tangible checkpoints every week that I could check off. I feel like I could measure my progress in a really direct way. And then the other big thing that happened, and I'll try to expedite this a little bit, but the other big thing that happened around then, I was really working on classical saxophone and checking out recordings and learning more about repertoire. But my second year, I was not playing in either wind ensemble. There was somebody that was playing in the Wind Symphony, which is a top performing group at the conservatory at UMKC, that had, I think, maybe missed a dress rehearsal or something happened to where Steve Davis, who's the director of bands there, sort of evicted that person from the ensemble. And when he went back to Professor Timmons and said, well, we've got to find somebody else to fill out the rest of the semester in the Wind Symphony, of course, they couldn't bring anybody up from the wind ensemble. They didn't want to compromise the second group. And then there were some other, you had to find somebody whose schedule worked with their other courses to fill the role. And, one way or another, that responsibility fell to me. So I was a sophomore jazz studies major who had really had no prior experience that would have prepared me for being in a group of that caliber with graduate students and especially with Professor Davis, who's pretty intense. And so I finished out the semester in that group and did my best, but I was easily the worst player in the ensemble, and it's not just being faux self-deprecating. I just was not prepared for that at all. But after the semester was over, I reached out to Professor Davis, and I didn't know this, but his primary instrument is saxophone. And so he had a certain level of empathy. He knew that I wasn't a bad musician. He knew that, he recognized that I was scuffling a little bit, but he knew it wasn't because I was not working hard and that I didn't have a work ethic and some gifts to work with. He just knew that I wasn't fluent in that style. So I sent him a message and basically said via email, I said, hey, I'm self-aware enough to know that I was the worst person in the Wind Symphony this year, but I want you to know that I really grew from it. I loved it. I'd like to do it again. What can I do to learn more about, at that time I was playing tenor in the group. I said, who should I listen to for classical tenor, and what can I do to be more authentic and learn more about this idiom? And he actually didn't just write back with some pointers, but he said, hey, what are you doing this Saturday? Let's meet up for lunch and we can talk about this further. And so he took, he must have sensed something about me that I was really sincere about this. And he took the extra time and we went out to lunch and we talked about his experiences and different recordings to check out and different names to write down. And I remember we were sitting there, and I had asked him a question, and he said, "Yeah," I remember him saying, "Oh, let me call my buddy Tim, who I teach at Interlochen with. My buddy Tim," is what he said, and placed a phone call, and there at the table. Of course, the significance of that was lost on me at the time, but he called Tim McAllister for advice from the table. So that experience, I really ran with that and ended up playing in the Wind Symphony, and ended up actually dual majoring in concert saxophone performance, and jazz studies at UMKC. And then I went to Cincinnati Conservatory and did a jazz studies degree. And one of the reasons I chose CCM was because they do, James Bunty is very fluent in jazz and classical styles. And at that time, James and Rick Van Meter they may still do it like this, but they did a joint studio class. So all the jazz majors and the classical majors were there together, and we critiqued each other. And so even if I wasn't studying classical saxophone, I was still hearing new repertoire and hearing good sounds and going to master classes with Zach Sheeman and Tim McAllister. And we had a lot of other guests at that time. Oasis, Nathan, who's on the call, of course, came and visited. So I was still, those ideas were percolating. And then at the end of my master's in jazz studies, I knew that I wanted to do the DMA, but I felt like first of all, I felt like a jazz studies DMA would have been redundant with the skills that I already had. Yeah, I felt like it would have been kind of redundant. The other thing is, artistically, I really just missed studying classical saxophone. I missed it a lot. I would go to recitals and I'd have these pangs of regret that I wasn't studying any classical. So when I got done with the Dr. Bunty was open-minded enough to say, well, if you want to do the DMA and study classical, we'd worked it out to where I could maybe do a jazz teaching assistantship but study classical and give classical recitals and get that saxophone performance degree. And that was kind of the plan for a while. But Tim Timmons actually reached out, and right around this time of year, maybe a few weeks prior, and said, well, I'm actually retiring. Would you want to come back? You can be my teaching assistant, teach all of the undergrad jazz majors that were like you, that were begrudgingly taking classical lessons. You teach them privately, and study with me for a year while you kind of get your chops back, so to speak. And then you would have a say in, selecting the next saxophone professor at UMKC. And so I also really missed Kansas City at the time. I missed the music scene there. I had a lot of friends there. So I ended up going back to Kansas City, and then, doing a year with Tim, and then finishing up the degree with Zach Sheeman. And then before I finished, I started teaching at UW Eau Claire, where I was at for 4 years. So, in my case, I was lucky in that I had two different opportunities at the graduate level. Two different really awesome opportunities that my playing didn't really warrant at that time to do a DMA with high level performers and teachers. But that was kind of, in my case, it was a combination of luck and, working personal connections that I had those opportunities. And I've often felt that there are other people out there, and I don't apologize for that because I worked really hard when I had those opportunities. But I've long felt that there are other people out there that probably would like to do that, but they maybe weren't able to have those options, at the graduate level to study with people of that caliber. So that's kind of my background, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we go throughout the presentation. But I guess the other thing is that in that quest to try and get my classical playing and my jazz playing both at that professional level, it seems to me that we have, if you go, I'm thinking about the opening night at NASA, if anybody was there, last month, which seems like a year ago, and hearing all those soloists that first night, I mean, there's such a clear picture, such a clear snapshot of where the standard is, who are the top players, that's not an all-inclusive view, of course, but a little snapshot of where the level is right now. And so we know what the standards are that we have to meet in classical saxophone. And then if you go hear Chris Potter and Joe Lovano and Joel Fromm and Seamus Blake and Will Vincent and Miguel Zanon, and the list goes on, Jaleel Shaw, we know very acutely where the standard is in that field as well. But it gets a little murkier when we talk about people that sort of want to occupy this third little strain. And to me, I remember really wrestling with that. Like when can I say confidently, like, no, I'm a legitimate studied concert saxophonist, you know? When can, how can I say confidently that, no, I'm really a fluent jazz player as well? What are the checkpoints that I need to meet? And it seems to me that when I look around at the saxophone community, we have these divergent trends. So on one hand, I think we all agree, any of us that have been going to the NASA biennials and following the Londex competition and all of these things the past few years, I mean, it's just astounding how quickly the level keeps going up. So when I was at, Tempe last month, I was thinking, man, I was just catching up to the things I heard in 2016. And when I was there in Cincinnati in 2016, I was thinking, man, I'm just trying to catch up to what I heard in Champaign in 2014. It just keeps going up and up and up. And I think it's the same thing in the jazz world. When I look at my Instagram Explore page, which is obnoxious, it's just littered with all these people I've never heard of that sound incredible. Of course, they sound incredible in a 59-second clip. So that's a whole other talk. But, so we have the standards going up independently of one another in jazz and in classical. And I think because of that, whether it's from teachers or I don't think it's from the community so much. I think it's more internal. People feel a pressure, I think, to specialize in order to keep up with those skyrocketing standards. And so we have that trend, right? And at the same time, when I look at job postings, whether they be military band audition excerpts or, some of the college teaching positions, they're going the other direction. They're asking more and more for people that aren't specialists. So whether that's playing jazz and classical or maybe studying classical and being a fluent doubler, or it could be any number of things, any number of sort of Swiss Army knife, skill sets. So we're going in opposite directions there. And then I think saxophonists, I think all musicians, especially people that are trying to get into higher ed, I read these postings that they list 5 different skills, right? You might be a small liberal arts college and it says saxophone, clarinet, flute, jazz studies, bassoon, something like that, 5 different things, all of which would really, to be a master of those disciplines, would probably require you to be quite myopic. And I read these positions and I go, how are they going to find a candidate that's going to fit, that's going to satisfy all of those requirements? And then after the search is over and they've identified a candidate, I mean, the truth is they're not finding people that satisfy all of those requirements. They're finding somebody that checks 2 of the boxes and then has been resourceful and clever enough, I think, to find something on their CV that makes it sort of appear that they might have some level of aptitude in the other 3. And this is not me calling anybody out. I mean, I think that's great. Like, so what everyone, any person in their right mind would do, to make themselves more employable. But what's happened, I think, in this particular strain, this sort of crossover jazz and classical strain, is that it's muddied. We don't have a clear picture of what that actually means to be a crossover player, because I think, and this goes to woodwind dubbing, this goes to any sort of multi-disciplined endeavor. We don't necessarily have a clear picture of what that means, because I think there are more people paying lip service to these things out of occupational necessity than actually living it. And so, I'll get things where, somebody will ask me what I do, and I say, or what I teach, and they might say, are you a classical player or a jazz player? And I say, well, I really try to do both at the highest level, and that's what I teach, And they'll go, oh, well, I know so-and-so, I know this other person that does the same thing. And come to find out what that really means is they might be a virtuoso classical player who played, a couple of pops shows that had a little bit of jazz in it. Or conversely, I'll talk to a great jazz saxophone player and they'll say, well, who else does that? So-and-so. And what it is that person's a monster jazz player who has a clip of them on social media, playing Bach cello suite on an Autolink 8, you know. And so anyway, this is a long 20-minute diatribe to kind of set up my presentation, which is just trying to define what does it mean to be authentic? You know, what are the checkpoints? What is the standard? If we view this other lane, this crossover lane, as a discipline in itself, how do we get to the essence of that? And what are the things that we need to be doing to effectively teach and perform in those idioms? So I am going to pull up here a little PowerPoint presentation. And by the way, I'm hoping that if people have questions as we go, if we have time at the end, I may get into some kind of pedagogy stuff. But mostly I'm just going to talk, I'm not going to get super deep in that. But if people have questions about pedagogy or you know, anything they want to offer, please type them to me. I'd love to hear from you. So why crossover? For me, it's primarily for a broader palette for artistic expression. There's a great quote from Stephen Duke, who's a retired professor of saxophone at Northern Illinois, and he said, a person's motives for learning another style affects the learning experience. Classical players frequently want to learn jazz because they want to become more marketable, and jazz players frequently want to learn classical music because they want to work on their chops. Both jazz and classical music are art forms, and being such demand commitment. Classically oriented musicians rarely view learning classical music as mere exercise, and jazz-oriented musicians are rarely motivated to learn jazz solely for monetary gain. In short, learning music in order to use it leaves out a basic value: music, the performing art. While artistic expression and fulfillment should be the primary goal, many salaried positions for saxophones, like military bands and college or public school teaching, ask for some level of aptitude in both realms. See higher ed jobs or military band audition excerpts. Again, I think that an important thing there is that if you want to pursue both of these roles, and I'll get into this more a little bit later, it shouldn't be motivated primarily about this idea of being more pragmatic or more practical, or you know, opening you up for more career opportunities. Of course, that's a benefit. You know, it's an ancillary benefit though, because I think if we get overly wrapped up in making artistic decisions, if we're primarily thinking about being practical and pragmatic, then we should all study actuarial science or engineering, or you know, be a banker or something like that. So we can go too far in that direction. But having said that, it does open up, I think it does make people more marketable. So here's a list of, and this is not comprehensive at all. In fact, this is a list I made a few years ago, so it's probably evolving, and there are other things now. But Ball State, UW Eau Claire, where I was at previously, Memphis, Troy, UW Milwaukee, Central Arkansas, Stevens Point, these military bands, Kingsville, my buddy Tom Zimmerman's down there, Zimmerman, Zinniger, why did I say Zimmerman? Tom Zinniger, Tarleton State, Baldwin Wallace, the list goes on. And then some opinions of mine about this that I think are important to establish, and also really primarily it's just an opportunity for me to use this totally ridiculous cartoon. I don't think every saxophonist needs to, excuse me, let me move some things around, needs to split their time equally between jazz and classical playing, or even split it at all. In fact, you know, I remember coming up, there was a guy named Kerry Strayer, who was a great composer. He led a big band in Kansas City. He was a great jazz baritone player, but he had studied classical with Tim Timmons at UMKC. And I remember him saying on a set break on a gig once, he said, well, you know, you can really only get your fundamentals together as a jazz player by studying classical, which I don't agree with at all. And he also, I remember him saying, like, well, why would you play saxophone and only play classical and not improvise? Like, what's the point? Which I don't agree with that either. My only point is that I hope we can be accepting of and maybe create more opportunities in academia for people who want to, who don't necessarily want to specialize, but maybe they want to be 50-50 or 70-30 or 30-70. And the last thing that's most importantly that harkens back to what Stephen Duke said is, if you don't genuinely love playing or listening to a certain style of playing, you'll never devote the necessary hours to it to achieve fluidity in that style. We can all think about how frustrating it is just in practicing the music that we love the most. We can think how tedious it is and frustrating to devote all these hours just to experience really infinitesimal gains. But what keeps us going on is, keeps us on that path is a really deep passion for, getting it together and sounding like our heroes, right? So, Brett McDonald is a good friend of mine that plays in Broadway shows, and he's a monster saxophone player and composer. He's gotten his flute and clarinet and I think even oboe to the degree where he doesn't really have a primary anymore. He doesn't consider himself as having a primary. And he talks about that with woodwind doublers, that he's saying, he talks to a lot of saxophone players that are like, well, I got to get on my flute and my clarinet, because that's going to get me Broadway gigs. And it's like, no, it's not, because if you don't have that passion, if you're not really deeply invested in that from an artistic perspective, you'll never put in the time to compete with the people who do feel that way. And I think that applies here to this whole crossover thing. The big thing for me is that I think we should be striving for authenticity in what we do, especially if we're claiming expertise in that particular field. So we'll come back to this a little bit. So authenticity, I think, is the buzzword here. Some of the challenges. So when I talk, if I'm doing a summer camp, or if I'm doing a run out at a high school, and I've got a big group of, I said 16, that's an arbitrary age, but high school saxophonists, sometimes I'll kind of gauge the temperature in the room if I don't know them, and I'll say, show of hands, who in here is more interested in jazz band than concert band? And you'll get a smattering. Who in here is more interested in concert band than jazz band? Same kind of thing, a couple of hands. And then I say, who enjoys both equally? And usually my experience is that the vast majority, they really, and it's like this with my private students too, my pre-college students, most of them tend to be kind of split down the middle. Artistically, they enjoy both. But then if I do the same thing at a college, all of a sudden the answer is a little bit more binary. There may be 2 or 3 people that say, well, I'm interested in both, but most people veer one way or another. So why is that? Well, I think one thing that I deal with here at University of Memphis and did previously at Eau Claire is that you might have a situation where you're trying to balance what's best for the student and his or her experience, but also you want to give your large ensemble directors their best possible section. So, for instance, I might have a music ed major who's a senior, and they might not have had any jazz ensemble experience before, and they're about to graduate and apply for jobs. And it's likely that some of those jobs, especially as a saxophone player, they might ask you to lead a jazz ensemble. So the best thing for that person would be to be placed in the first or maybe more ideally the second jazz ensemble. But then I may have 10 people that are much stronger jazz players than they are, right? So I'm left with this decision. Do I go with the 10 best so that my ensembles sound the best and I look good as the studio professor and I make my colleagues happy? Or do I maybe, dial it back a little bit? Maybe the section's not quite as strong, but you're giving the best opportunity for that individual student. And it's a constant dance that we do. But I think a lot of times that's a tough decision to make because you want to have the hot section in the wind ensemble, and it goes both ways, with a lot of my really strong jazz students. They really, they might really, really benefit from being in the wind ensemble, but then do I want to subject, the wind ensemble director to having somebody who's ill-equipped to be there? I think a lot of times private teachers or studio professors hear a more natural bent one way or the other, and whether it's conscious or subconscious, they'll steer a student that direction without necessarily checking in on where their interests lie. So I've had this is a common refrain with people I've talked about, talked to, I should say, where they'll say, oh, I used to play jazz. I used to play in the jazz ensemble, and I used to transcribe, and I loved playing, but my private teacher could tell I was a better classical player, so we just worked on classical. And again, it works the other way too. The people that were really interested in, I've talked to a lot of great jazz players who say, oh yeah, I used to love studying Glazunov and Ibert and the tableau and all this stuff. I really enjoyed it, but I was a better jazz player, so we went that direction. And maybe it's a good thing. I think in a lot of cases, probably the vast majority of cases, is that in those 5 years, again, that's an arbitrary selective endpoint between 16 and 21, the student has become more discerning and has a clearer picture on his or her own. If that's the case, that's great. Again, I'm not advocating for pushing people in a direction that's not in line with their artistic sensibilities. I think graduate programs are exclusionary to players who might want to cross over. I think I'm thinking back to UMKC even, and I can say this because they're both retired now, but Bobby Watson and Tim Timmons, of course they respected each other and liked and respected each other, but they literally, at schools that have two studio professors, one jazz and one classical, they were literally working in different buildings on opposite ends of campus. So it wasn't indicative of any sort of rift at all, but they just weren't communicating on that. So, if you have a candidate that's maybe third in line for an assistantship in the classical studios for Tim, and maybe that same candidate is third or fourth for, doing an MM in jazz studies, for instance, they're probably not communicating. And that also, begs a lot of other questions, right? Like, should studio professors consider taking their second or third candidate, knowing that they had this other skill? That's a highly, that's a deep question to ask, and there's a lot of different layers to that. I also think that sometimes when I go, I'm just thinking about in North America, sometimes saxophone does seem like a little bit of an arms race, and that people might be motivated by competition with other studios. And if that's the case, and that's great competition, right? I think that's one of the reasons we have so many great players coming out of so many different schools, is that element of competition. But then if that's your motivation, you're going to take the best players that are going to sound best in your quartet so you can win Fish-Off or whatever. And I don't blame anybody for that, but then there might be other candidates who might actually be more employable in the long term, but they're not quite at that level to get a graduate assistantship or be accepted. The other thing is, I think it's more difficult on saxophone than any other instrument, in my estimation. So when I talk to trumpet players and trombone players, pianists, bass players, there seem to be more of them on other instruments that are really, really fluent, really, really authentic. And a lot of times when I talk to them about that, they're using the same embouchure, they're using the same air support, airflow, however you want to think about it, and the same equipment. And so the only thing that they're really, when they're talking about crossing over, they're talking mostly about just the mental, the different artistic mindset, right? The vernacular. But we have to actually deal with equipment and musculature, and for me, all of those things, it's so different. There might be some people that cross over on saxophone that have a similar embouchure and voicing or whatever. For me, it's entirely different. It's almost like playing a separate instrument. So I think it's harder that way. The last thing is that I think it's really tough on the ego. So the top recitalists and top jazz improvisers, the ones that we all geek out on and aspire to be like, are typically pretty myopic about what they do. And I think in order to be a really capable musician in any field, it requires you to be acutely aware of the difference between good and great, great and excellent, excellent and virtuoso, and being able to discern these infinitesimal, tiny differences. And it's that quality, it's a double-edged sword, because that quality that allows us to get there also makes us competitive and acutely aware of where we're falling short. So it's really tough on the ego. In my case, I remember when I started that DMA at UMKC, I was coming off of, at CCM, I had won like the Downbeat Graduate College Soloist Award and was a finalist in NASA Jazz, and we put out some albums, and I felt like I was sort of, developing a reputation, locally and nationally, with some accolades in the jazz world. And so it wasn't that I was egotistical, but I had a certain confidence that came with that. And so I'm riding high coming out of CCM, and I go back and I hit the reset button, and I'm shaking off 2 years of rust, and knowing full well that I wasn't playing at a graduate level in concert saxophone at that time. And all of a sudden I'm sitting in Wind Symphony with these junior music ed majors who were doing things in terms of refinement that, you know, I felt like we're at a higher level than what I was doing at that time. And it was really tough. Not a lot of people, I think, can submit themselves to that. Once they've, you know, achieved a certain level of success in one area, it's so difficult to go a couple rungs back down the ladder and submit yourself to humbling yourself to build it up again. The great article on this is Don Senna, Starting Over, and I think that was a music education journal, maybe early 90s, I want to say. If anybody's interested, email me. I've got a PDF of it. Very interesting. Where Sinta talks about this a little bit. You know, that he took a sabbatical to try and work on his improvisation. He talks about the mental element of it a lot. Okay, so the meat of this presentation here is, this is highly, again, I just want to reassert that this is highly subjective and open to interpretation. And, you know, I'm not a big enough solipsist to think that, that what I say goes and that we should all live by this. But this is what I want to submit, what I've arrived at as what constitutes authenticity in both fields. So if there's a Venn diagram of saxophone practice that's equally applicable to both idioms, there's a lot of overlap, you know, and I'm throwing estimates of a number, I don't know, maybe 40%, but what about the other 60%? You know, do we just have to practice that much extra? I think that's, you may be, but I think it's kind of disingenuous to just suggest that, like, oh, well, if you want to do both, you know, if the best classical players are practicing 4 and 5 hours a day, and the best jazz players are practicing 4 to 5 hours a day, then to be good at both, you need to practice 10 hours a day. Well, I don't think that's really tenable, if it's possible at all. So I think it's useful to consider trying to identify what are the absolute core tenets for efficiency's sake, so we might be able to, like, have some friends, is what I wrote here. So here's a Venn diagram I scribbled up that looks more like a MasterCard logo than I realized until just now. But you see some things that I sort of stream of consciousness thought about, that, you know, things that I'm practicing in the classical realm, things in the jazz realm, and then things that kind of apply to both. So here are sort of some checkpoints, you know, I think to be authentic in the jazz realm. And I'm thinking specifically about people maybe who are really strong and well-studied classical saxophonists trying to get better in the jazz realm. And there are certain things that are a little bit more concrete, more objective, and easy to quantify. And there are other things that I think are a little bit more subjective and hard to quantify. So things in the jazz realm that are difficult to quantify would be eighth note feel. You know, this is a difficult thing to talk about. We can talk about eighth notes being subdivided by a triplet, and then you beam the first two together, and that's a swing eighth note. It's sort of true, but it's contingent upon tempo and era, and also it's contingent upon there's lots of different ways to skin that cat, you know. And so developing that authentic eighth note feel is a really deep mine. You know, there are elements of it that I feel like cannot be codified. We'll come back to this, maybe one of the practice strategies. I've listed some practice strategies, things that I do with my students working on this. And that's where that Mad Auto link, maybe if we have time, we'll come back to it. Articulation. So one thing is this idea of N tonguing. So it's almost like actually saying the syllable N in your mouth, or muffle tonguing. Great resource for this also is Mark Watkins' new book, From the Inside Out. He has a whole chapter on this thing. It's basically where you either on the underside of the reed or to the side of the reed, you're articulating, but kind of halfway. So you're making contact and you're sort of muting the sound. This is one of those techniques that we don't see as much in classical saxophone that I think concert saxophonists have a little bit of a learning curve to get used to. So again, I have some things we may come back to with pedagogy. And then voicing and embouchure of flexibility. So you know, some of this is very similar to what we do in classical, but to me, you know, I play with a permanent overbite, you know, with my lower lip closer to the tip of the reed, and I bunch my chin a little bit. But the other thing is that it's mobile. My jaw will move And it's not something I'm conscious of. It's just developing that flexibility and the awareness that I can color notes in different registers different way here. And then I have an exercise that I love for that I stole from Tom Meyer from University of Colorado. Things that are a little easier to quantify. So repertoire. To me, I think that you should have 45 standards memorized, committed to memory that you could play on a gig. And I arrived at that number by thinking about if you were playing a 3-hour standards gig or playing at a jazz club and you needed to play 3 sets, let's say 5 tunes a set, so that's 15. But you also want to make sure that you have a second and a third option in case the one guy in the band doesn't know the tune. So in order to be a gigging jazz musician without reading out of a real book, which I think is a faux pas, you need to have 45 committed. And so you want to consider variety, tonality, static versus functional harmonies, some sort of variety. And again, you're thinking about in a very practical way, being on a gig, and you can't, if you know 15 tunes, you're going to be lucky if everyone else in the band knows all those 15, right? So you need to have a backup and then a second backup. So 45 to me is that magic number. And by knowing a tune, I mean knowing the melody, knowing the changes, and also knowing intros and endings. And sometimes there's more than one intro, more than one ending. That's a whole other topic. Chord scale theory, and for me, a lot of it has to do with dominant chords. So a lot of times when I talk to sort of intermediate improvisers and I ask them, what do you play over a dominant chord? They'll say Mixolydian. Well, that's not really a wrong answer per se, but it's like going to an Indian restaurant and ordering a bowl full of basmati rice. Like there's no flavor to that. And when you really check out transcriptions of what the fluent improvisers are using over dominant chords, it's almost never, just Mixolydian. And then along with that goes this understanding of function. So probably what extensions you would play over a dominant 2 or 5 of 5. You might go towards natural extensions, 9, sharp 11, 13. But if that dominant chord is functioning as a 5 of 2 in the key, you're going to think altered extensions, flat 13, flat 9, maybe sharp 9. Not getting too deep in the mind here, but that's something that I feel like is one of the litmus tests. Do you understand all that? Do you understand the different sounds over dominant chords? I think it's one thing to be able to improvise over a chord, a static chord, a major chord, or a minor chord. That's not that unusual. Where the rubber meets the road to me is, when you have those dominants that have a function, how are you playing over those? How are you connecting one, chord or one harmonic palette to another? Aural training, so being able to identify chord qualities, identify feel harmonic rhythm. So sometimes I'll have students that they might be able to write down the chord changes on staff paper to a tune, so they know it. But then when they improvise, they'll be addressing the wrong chord at the wrong time. So they haven't reconciled that part of your brain that's thinking of a line with the part of your brain or your heart that's feeling where the chords are changing. This is something I struggled with a ton in undergrad. Also being able to hear common chord progressions in root movement, and then kind of along with the chord scale theory, dominant chord extensions and the derivative scales they imply. So I say these are easier to quantify because you can just kind of hear it when somebody improvises. And then also ostensibly you could come up with a test, right? You could come up with a test like a jazz theory 2 or jazz theory 3 or whatever, some sort of college test that you could fill out to judge somebody's aptitude in this way. Absorption of accepted jazz syntax. So by that I mean, learning language from transcriptions and then regurgitating that or reorganizing that. And then a really big thing is the ability to address chord changes. And when I say changes, you notice nobody ever says the term, oh, that guy plays or that girl plays great chords. They say they play great changes, right? And that means it's not really about what you play over the chord when it's happening. It's about the way that you connect this chord to the next chord. And so one way that I gauge whether a student can do that or not is can they go through a tune from memory and first of all improvise an entire chorus where they're only playing thirds and sevenths on the downbeat of every chord change, And then from there, once they can do that, we work on improvising an eighth note lead in to that downbeat, and then a 2/8 note lead in, and then a 3/8 note lead in. So they're not just being able to identify those color tones, the thirds and sevenths, but they're being able to think ahead and play a line that sort of has good voice leading and gets into those notes. So we'll come back to this maybe a little bit. And then composition, I think that everyone should have at least an album's worth of original compositions. So 5 to 6 tunes. I think that's a really big part of that world. You know, being a effective jazz player and pedagogue, you have to have a little bit of knowledge of composition. And maybe next to this, I would write aptitude at the piano. If I were to do another draft of this, I would say composition slash some jazz piano chops. Now in the classical world, authenticity, things that are difficult to quantify, vibrato, speed, width, consistency, centering the pitch. And again, this is difficult because there are players who I deeply admire who have a vibrato concept that's way different than what I would teach to my students as a good vibrato concept. Of course, we all hear that. And that's a little bit subjective and difficult to quantify when they're actually getting there. But we also kind of know it when we hear it too. Having an awareness of a changing performance standard. So we revere and study the past masters, but we're also aware that they may not be the best direction for style in the 21st century. And that Glazunov and Ibert are great works, but they don't indicate mastery any more than a few courses of blue bossa do in jazz. And it's just this is something I encounter a lot, which is that, like for instance, I had a really great, I played a gig with a great jazz saxophone player in the past couple of years, and super nice guy, great player, really cool. And he was just making conversation after the gig on the set break. And he said, oh, I hear you play classical saxophone. I hear you do the classical thing too. He said, well, I do too. We should get together and play some duets. And then he stopped himself and said, well, I haven't since 1990, but I do. And I thought, oh, that means that's not really promising, And so I think sometimes I talk to people who maybe they studied concert saxophone at one point, maybe they did an undergraduate degree, or they took four semesters of lessons, 20 or 30 years ago, and they've not really kept up with it since. And their idea of who the best or most revered players, and also what the standard repertoire, what the sort of litmus test repertoire is totally out of balance with the way that it is now. And I experienced this too, starting my DMA, which is my frame of reference was, that I remember thinking Barry 09 and Denisov and Albright were like that's kind of as far as my awareness went at that point in terms of like what I would say contemporary works. And of course, we know now, those are well-worn standards at this point. There's a lot of material that's that difficult, and that, that seems kind of tame by comparison. So I think having that awareness of the changing standard is really important. An altissimo range that more closely matches the timbre of the rest of the horn. So I hear a lot of great practitioners in jazz saxophone. I'm thinking of like Ben Wendell or Seamus Blake, Josh Redmond. They sound incredible up there. Full stop, amazing facility and lines and all this kind of stuff. But you hear them play their altissimo. A lot of times, it's a non-saxophonist would know there's something different about that tessitura. Whereas I think when we hear the best concert saxophonists, they're striving towards making that register just sound like a natural extension of the horn, that it has this roughly the same timbre and accuracy in terms of intonation and full body of sound. I think that's a bigger value set in classical. And then awareness and use of contemporary techniques. I always say contemporary techniques instead of extended techniques. My buddy Nick Zulek was the first person to kind of hit me to that, because extended implies that it's auxiliary. Contemporary is more inclusive, maybe in a certain way. Things that are a little bit easier to quantify in classical. And there's one thing that I wanted to add to this that I forgot to put on here that I'll mention in a second. Embouchure, so the flat, flat chin, corners in, something you can look in a photo and say, is that a good classical embouchure? And then keeping your jaw stable so that it doesn't move out, back and forth too much. Beginnings and ends of sound, or Steve Duke calls them attack transients. That's a term that I use sometimes if I want to seem, overly cerebral. But just this idea of getting rid of that air sound or tongue stop. So a lot of great, maybe you'll be able to hear it, or the speakers, I'm not sure, but my outgoing DMA student, Rasan Barber, is an incredibly accomplished and well-known jazz and studio player. We were working on classical saxophone, and we spent a ton of time, our first month almost, it seemed like, of lessons, just getting to the point where he could get a beautiful sound on the neck with no tongue, without moving here, without getting either like an airy scoop or a bump from too much embouchure pressure, or reflexively tongue stopping, something like that at the end. And then and then also not defaulting to subtone to get the lower register to speak. Greater precision with intonation, and an awareness of alternate fingerings for intonation. So I'll have students do a tuning chart, like there's one in the Art of Saxophone Playing, Larry Teal, and I'll have them do a tuning chart and then list next to it what are the solutions in terms of alternate fingerings, and there's all kinds of different things. And then maybe I'll have them write a little bit about the context in which they might use that alternate fingering based on volume or function in a chord and all those variables. Repertoire, I think this is, again, this is highly subjective, but something that I've thought of as sort of a checkpoint. Having at least a recital's worth of music composed post 1970, or I should say post 1969, because I wanted to get Denisov in there. So just at least having an awareness of new, relatively new music, that's a relative term. But I think sometimes some of the neophyte classical saxophonists, I think, are so concerned with learning the chestnuts that, again, it goes back to being aware of the changing standard. And then having studied and performed a minimum of 20 of the standards. So even that term, standard, is sort of subjective. But I arrived at that number saying, okay, let's say that you have 4 people in a class. You got 4 seniors getting ready for recitals, and they're playing 5 pieces per program, that you'd be able to, you'd have at least experience and knowledge, experiential knowledge of those without being redundant, right? You could teach all those pieces. So ideally, of course, we're talking about a minimum standard, right? Ideally, our knowledge would be much higher than this and much wider and deeper. Let's see here. We have a question. I'm going to stop screen sharing. So Chance Stein, hey Chance. Let's see here. So have you found that the classical world looks upon players searching for authenticity in jazz as not fully committed or less serious, and vice versa for the jazz world? If so, how do we go about attaining authenticity on both sides while still being respected as legitimate by the other side? I don't think so anymore. This is a really good question. I don't think so anymore. Not among saxophonists. I've actually found saxophonists to be quite open-minded about it. At least people that are my contemporaries, and I've always felt supported. Like when I was studying with Zach Sheeman, he held me to a high standard, as high as he could, as a classical player. But he also came out to my jazz gigs. He never told me not to play gigs, but he and Mary would come and support me. And I always felt like that went in both directions. Where I have sensed it is from non-saxophonists, that I will say I did experience in my early years college teaching that there were some faculty on other instruments that when I submitted for my annual review, I actually left certain jazz gigs, even prestigious ones, off the list, off of my CV, because if they felt that there was if they felt that there was an imbalance just visually, that they felt that I was prioritizing one or the other. And of course, that's difficult because there are just more jazz gigs available than classical, right? So I was performing more as a jazz artist, but that's not necessarily what I was practicing or teaching. In the jazz world, I don't think that, I haven't really found that to be the case. In fact, I've been surprised by how many really great jazz players have showed interest in learning classical, and they've been, very fascinated by that. I think an example would be Rahsaan. I was mentioning earlier, Rahsaan Barber. He came here, and I said, oh, if you're going to do the DMA, we should study classical. Like, you don't need 3 more years of jazz lessons. We should kind of develop this extra skill. And man, he's like totally bought in. He's totally interested in it. And how far he takes it, in his own playing, I'm not sure, moving forward, but I know that he really has a deep appreciation for that. I'm going to go back and circle back, I think, to a couple of, I don't want to go too much longer, but I want to circle back to a couple of maybe quick practice methods or things that I use with my students that I find helpful. And in the meantime, if anybody else has any questions, please type them down. I'd like to circle back and check them out. So let's see here. Go back to the PowerPoint. So I just want to hit some of those things I talked about and maybe didn't get that deep into it. So one thing that I really like that I found to be the most helpful for, and I work on this with like strictly jazz students to get a little bit more spread quality in their sound or a little bit more flexibility. And it's something I stole by proxy from a student of mine that studied with, took an ad hoc lesson with Tom Meyer, who's at Boulder. And so I call them, to give him properly credit, I call them Meyer bends with my students. And so he taught this to Vince, who then taught it to me. And then I emailed Tom to make sure I was doing it correctly. And I love this exercise. It's basically a flexibility exercise. And in this case, obviously when we do flexibility in a classical setting, maybe we're working on palm key flexibility or mouthpiece flexibility. We're trying to make all those changes about 95% I would say, inside the oral cavity, not moving our jaw or changing anything here, but just changes with the tongue, right? In this case, I give my students the flexibility. In fact, I encourage them to be able to, they can roll out their lip or bunch their chin if it helps them, or play with an overbite, any number of things. So you can use the outside and the inside. Basically, there's a bunch of false fingerings that you can play and try to bend them down a minor third evenly and back up. So the first one is I finger, and I'll show a slide later if anybody wants to, check it out, screenshot it later. But the first one is octave bis. So I finger octave bis 4, 5, 6 and E flat. Octave bis 4, 5, 6 and E flat. And I want to bend that pitch down a minor third and back up. So you can kind of see from the side that I'm moving back and forth. I'm rolling my lip out, that's optional. And I'm bunching my chin, also optional. But and I eventually want to get to that point where, first of all, I'm able to do that evenly, so there's not like a click. Some students will work on it, and the pitch will drop suddenly. Like they'll get the minor third, but it drops suddenly, almost like a teenage boy who's going through puberty. Like, yeah, it'll drop like that, and you want to iron that out so it's even. And eventually get to where you can kind of do it like a tremolo. So that's the first finger, and that's the easiest one. The next one is no octave, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and C4, so your palm key F. So that you'll be fingering E and bending down to a C sharp. The next one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and E flat and C2, so palm key E flat. And then the last one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and C1, which is D. And then the last one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and E1, which is D. And then the last one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and C1, which is D. And then the last one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and E1, which is D. And then the last one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and C1, which is D. And then the last one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and E1, which is D. And then the last one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and C1, which is D. And then the last one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and E1, which is D. And then the last one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and C1, which is D. And then the last one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and E1, which is D. And then the last one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and E1, which is D. And then the last one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and E1, which is D. And then the last one is 1, And so to me, this is really more of an important feedback mechanism. It just says, without getting too analytical, if you're able to achieve that flexibility, then doing that every day, it just kind of opens you up. And it also gives you the feedback that says that, yeah, you're flexible enough here to get that kind of more spread quality. Let's see here, scrolling through really quickly. Oh, one thing I was going to say, this is kind of out of order, but when I was talking about easier to quantify on the classical side of things, I think one thing, in order to claim that you're a concert saxophonist, I think you need to be giving at least one full recital every year. That's the other thing I didn't put on here. Again, imagine a jazz saxophonist that says, "Oh yeah, I'm a great jazz player," and they haven't played a gig, they haven't played a full set in months. You know, it'd be the same kind of thing. You go like, well, okay, how active are you really? But if I showed a little bit about, working on the neck. And then I also wanted to kind of show an exercise that I love that kind of works for that I think works is a really good utility exercise, which are these arpeggios. I stole this from Zach Sheeman. And Zach stole them from the Taffanel Gobert book of flute exercises, the 17, I think. And this is a really great exercise because it works on chord knowledge for your improvisers. So one thing I'll do, hopefully you can all see it here. And basically you start with dominant 7, then you lower the 3rd to make it minor, then you lower the 5th to make it half diminished, then you lower the 7th again to make it fully diminished. And then if you lower the root, you're at dominant 7th in a new key, and you're doing this, full range. On this very dry reed. And this is a great exercise. With my jazz students, first of all, it's just help for them to have the dexterity and just know what the notes are in the 7th chords. But I also have them, it's an aural training exercise, so I have them go to the piano and play the root. And before they play the chord quality, they sing it rubato, just so they're singing the root, 3rd, 5th, and 7th, and then they play. So it's helpful for jazz musicians in that way. And then for classical, it's great because you can use this for obviously dexterity and evenness of sound. You can also apply articulation patterns to it. And then one thing, when I was working on circular breathing, this was a litmus test for me, is like, could I get through all of the arpeggios circular breathing? So this is a really great exercise. One other thing, and I'm just going through this really quick so I can let you guys get on with your lives. I was talking about articulation, different styles of articulation between jazz and classical. And so for me, when I'm playing, I'm using this classical articulation. I'm trying to play the, for me, the length of my tongue, what feels natural for me is to be a little bit farther back, as you can see. But the important thing that I stress is that you're making contact with the tip of the reed and not the underside. And if you're doing that, one way to test that is to put, a non-toxic black marker on a reed that you don't mind ruining, and saturating it here, putting it on the mouthpiece, and then playing an articulated passage. And then you look on your tongue, and it gives you a visual proof of what part of the tongue you're using and if you're being efficient that way. But then for me, this is sort of proof that when I'm playing jazz and doing the end tonguing or muffle tonguing, if you see on the left side here is sort of my jazz articulation. So that means that I'm hitting, on the underside of the reed a little bit. So that's something that you can experiment on your own and with your students as well for articulation. Then I have a little bit about balancing your practice time and finding things that have good value in both idioms. So practicing your major scales from the Dorian and Mixolydian mode. When you practice ascending melodic minor, like my students who work out of the Trent Kinniston daily studies, and it has the melodic minor with the changing forms. But if you practice the ascending melodic minor, you should practice it from the 7th degree, the 7th mode, which is the altered scale in jazz, also the 4th degree, which is Lydian dominant. And those are really important, very common applications to dominant sevenths. Taffanel Gobert arpeggios, I mentioned. The Liqueur etudes are great for half whole diminished, whole tone, getting facilities with those. Another thing that I've done with my classical or my jazz students, especially that are learning classical, is learn an entire piece. And I usually keep it to something fairly simple and tonal, but learn an entire piece without the score. Just get a recording. So that's something that's really native to jazz players that come through that tradition, is mimicry, right? And transcribing, learning things by ear. And jazz musicians, I feel like jazz trained musicians, that feels really comfortable for them, is they'll pick up nuance and style and sound nuance and vibrato nuance, that it comes quicker rather than trying to explain it to them verbally. They'll pick it up off a recording better. And so you're working on a familiar skill, but applying it to a new discipline. The other thing is here, you know, I have a couple of examples that I put here that are, you can find material in really common concert saxophone literature that works really well. I'm gonna drag this over in a jazz context. So for instance, if you look at this last system here, this is, to me, is the fifth mode of harmonic minor. So it's E harmonic minor, but it's applied to its 5 chord. So this material, if I went to the piano right now and played a concert D7 with a flat 9 and a flat 13, in fact, I'll do it right now. It sounds really great. I mean, it's something you could actually practice and use in your jazz playing. Hopefully people can hear me, but if I play D7, concert D7, flat 9, flat 13, or just a dominant going to minor, like that's an idea to me that would totally sound really hip in a jazz context. And you think about the second movement, at the beginning of the second movement of Ibert, or the cadenza in Des Enclos, has a lot of octatonic or half whole diminished, you know, that you could apply to dominant 7, flat 9, natural 13. And another one would be the Dubois cadenza. All of these ideas work over all these chords, right? So one thing that's made my practice more efficient, if I'm going to spend the time to learn this material, I'm always thinking about it analytically. In fact, when I was working on Andy Scott 3-letter word, I actually went through and there's all this arpeggio material, and I went through and wrote chord symbols above everything, because since I already had that knowledge and I'm already used to computing things that way, it expedited my process of learning it that much. So I think that is all I have today for the sake of time. This is something I could talk about forever. It's something I'm really passionate about. I think I'll call it here, but if anybody's interested in exploring this more, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint. There's a ton of stuff here that I didn't share for the studio class, and also just, I'm glad to talk about it. It's something I really care about a lot. So if you want to get in touch with me, my email address is mashults@memphis.edu. So that's MA and then Shults, no C's, no Z's. And I'm glad to answer any questions anybody has about the presentation. All right, I hope everyone is staying safe and sane. And I appreciate you guys taking the time today. So take care.